Today we're going to wrap all of this up. I'm going to go through a lot of the initial stuff fairly quickly because really the most interesting elements for us are the anathemas. And we'll get to that. This will be the last Bible study for 2 weeks. We're going to take a break next week. I need to drink some scotch and relax, and then we'll come back the following. That was for you guys and your alcohol advertisement that you decided to have. Yeah. And then we'll come back and we'll start RC's The Holiness of God.
Do you have that date?
20th. So, what I want to start out with is talking about the Iconodulists and the Iconoclasts. Last week we saw that the whole issue of icons did not arise in the 7th century. It didn't just pop up in the 600s. This has been something that has been discussed and practiced since the 2nd century, since Irenaeus. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk about the Iconodulists first and their contribution, and then I'm going to talk about the Iconoclasts and their rejection. We begin with Irenaeus, who emphasized Christ as, excuse me, the image of the invisible God. He cites Colossians 1:15. And this becomes a central theme to icon theology moving forward. So as we see, it's already present in the 2nd century. He argues that because the Son truly became flesh, God can now be depicted. This is one of the arguments that the Iconodulists picked up from not only Irenaeus, but through, as we saw last week, Pseudo-Dionysius. And this idea of the depiction of the Son because of the Incarnation is the earliest theological foundation for icons. Irenaeus is one of the ones that developed the doctrine of recapitulation, which becomes problematic. But he teaches that Christ I don't know what's going on. Christ restores the image of God in humanity, thereby making visible representation a legitimate category. All right? So keep that idea of recapitulation because there's a parallel to it in the East. So what does this mean for icon theology? Well, number one, Irenaeus does not discuss painted icons directly. This is a little bit early in the discussion, but he does provide the core principle that is later used by those who defend the use of icons. The key principle is if the Son is the visible image of the Father, if he is the icon of the Father, then depicting him affirms the Incarnation, and according to Irenaeus, is not idolatry. If Scripture tells us, if Colossians 1:15 tells us that Jesus is the icon of the Father, then according to Irenaeus, all we're doing is repeating Scripture. And these two principles, or actually the latter principle, becomes the cornerstone for future icon theology. Our next great iconodule is Basil the Great. Now we're jumping about 150 years forward. Now, Basil provides the first explicit theological framework for the use of icons. Now, he teaches that honor given to an image, and you have to pay attention to the language, the honor given to an image passes to, or more accurately, the honor given to an image passes through the image to the principle, or to that which is being honored. So if you're looking at an image of Jesus or an image of Mary or an image of one of the saints, whatever honor you give to that image passes through that image to that saint. Now, Basil makes a distinction. And this becomes very important for the West. Basil makes a distinction between the natural icon and the artificial icon. The natural icon, the Son as the image or the icon of the Father, therefore, because he is the image or the icon of the Father, he is of the same substance of the Father. Therefore, the icon that represents him is a natural representation. Then there's an artificial representation, according to Basil, and those are the painted images that we see that resemble the prototype, both in appearance, but not in essence. So notice a couple of things already. We're talking about a recapitulation, which is a metaphysical act. We're talking about the icon being a means to move through from the earthly to the heavenly. And we're talking now about essences being applied to icons. Man, I don't know what's going on with my chest. I guess I shouldn't have taken Mucinex. Now, Basil becomes important because he gives the church the first truly philosophical and theological framework and vocabulary to explain why venerating icons is important. But the key, he says, it is not worship. Now you'll notice, as we go through, the beginning of this discussion makes a clear distinction between what is taking place. Honor is not worship. They make that very clear. Okay, so when you interact with an icon, what you're doing, you're not worshiping that icon. This will change. And for Basil, and then moving forward, this becomes essentially the spine. It becomes the backbone of iconic theology. All right? And then the last one is probably the most important of all three, and that is John of Damascus, or as we called him last week, John of Damascene. All right? He is the one that develops a full systematic theology of icons, and he shows up in 655. So we're now in the 7th century, moving into what ultimately becomes a controversy. Okay, he's the first one to identify clearly and precisely how we are to understand the theology of icons. He does this in what is called his 3 treatises on divine images. So the core element of John is, number one, the incarnation is foundational. So because the Word became flesh, and again, pay attention to the language, matter can mediate divine grace. Matter can mediate divine grace. Now, I all have scrunchy looks on your face. What's the concern with why are you scrunching your faces? Matter can mediate divine grace.
Flesh that out.
I'm scrunching mine because matter is inanimate.
Do you not believe that matter can mediate divine grace?
I don't know what you mean.
Is this a
by
trick
mediate.
question?
What does mediate
the
mean?
statue of Mary Christ here, is, that kind of thing?
What does the word mediate mean?
To represent?
No, not really.
Reconcile.
Stand between two conflicting
Being
things.
an
Okay,
effect
one at a time, not 30 at once, one at a time.
To stand between two conflicting or two arguing parties and
Like
try
an
to
arbitrator.
bring in.
Well, it doesn't have to be arguing, but to
or
stand between
debating.
two parties, right?
Yeah.
Okay. Is there any place where we actually believe that?
The
She
Eucharist
resents
represents
You better be careful when you answer this, because you're about half a hair away from being a heretic if you deny this.
Yeah.
I heard somebody say it.
Jesus
Eucharist?
representing us to his Father.
The Eucharist.
Eucharist.
I said it.
Yeah, you did.
Every Sunday we believe that matter mediates divine grace. Now, we don't believe that the bread and the wine become the actual body and blood of Christ. We believe that the bread and the wine are the instruments through which we receive. That's just an expanded way of saying that it mediates divine grace. So our initial reaction when we hear these things is to be repulsed. But if we pause for half a second and are judicious in analyzing this, we can say, okay, maybe. Now, I'm not saying that John's argument is 100% correct, because there's a specific reason why there's a problem with John's argument versus the Eucharist. The Eucharist is taught to us in Scripture. John's argument is not. That's a philosophic and a theological extrapolation from what he reads from Scripture. So, again, precision in language and in understanding the argument becomes critical in these things. But that is the foundation of his argument, that matter can mediate divine grace.
So, I pray, well, not pray, but I'm giving honor to Mary, the statue of Mary, as a saint. And then she can mediate for me with her son?
You're using it in that's not what they mean by, Mary's not mediating anything. The image of Mary, the image of Mary, the statue or the icon of Mary as a means of, you know what? Hold off on that,
Yeah.
because there's actually an explanation in just a second.
Okay.
And I'm actually fighting saying the term
Okay.
because it'll give it away, so hang on, okay? According to John, depicting Christ affirms his true humanity. So any image you see of Christ is a legitimate depiction of the incarnation of his humanity. John makes a big deal, a very big deal, about defending matter. Why would it be important to defend matter? Now, we discussed this way back.
To refute the Gnostics.
That's one very important issue that John wants us to understand. And he goes back all the way to where? If you're going to sit and make an argument that matter is good, where are you going to go?
To Genesis?
Genesis. And God created blah, 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 and what were the last, and what did he say?
It was good.
And it was good. So John is staying as scriptural as he can be right now by defending matter. And he said it is not only good, but it was created for a sacramental use. Water, right? Oil, right? And of course, bread and wine. He also argued that the images we see are prototyped realism. Now, let me explain. Icons, and here we go with language again, participate in the reality of the prototype through likeness and hypostatic reference. Here's where we start to kind of peel away and have some
Could you
concerns.
say that again?
I am,
Icons
I will.
participate.
Icons participate in the reality of the prototype, or just think of the first type. Through likeness, look at Peter's icon, through likeness, right? But also hypostatic reference. That image, according to John, not only participates in the reality of acknowledging Peter, but that image participates in or is a reference to the union of Peter with that icon, the hypostatic reference. Okay? You're going to see as we go along, you start out going okay, and then you go and then you go, wait a minute. And according to John, these intermediaries link. They link the visible with the invisible. And then, of course, we get into the really sticky issue, veneration versus worship. Okay? Now, according to John, Latteria, worship belongs to God alone. However, veneration, proskuneo or dulia, is relative honor directed through the icon to whatever is being referenced. And this became the dogmatic distinction in the Second Council of Nicaea. John becomes critically important because he is the culmination. You add up Irenaeus, Basil, Suda Dionysius, and you come to John, and John's the culmination of icon theology. He integrates, I just said it, I'll just give you the specifics. He integrates Irenaeus' incarnation theology. He uses Basil's image prototype language and logic, and he provides the church with a quote-unquote coherent, philosophical, biblical, and liturgical defense of icons. This is the argument. And his theology is the basis for what happens as the triumph of orthodoxy in 843. Okay? So those are the pros. Now we get into the naysayers. The first one is Leo III. Now, I want you to notice the three people here, right? Father, Son, grandson, great-grandson. All right? So that's the breakdown of the relationships. Notice where Constantine VI sits, though. Right? He's between. That should tell you something about the influence that he allegedly, it was his mother, but his authority. She was using his imperial authority. So Leo III is the first iconoclast. And Leo, who began analyzing this situation, was the one that really started to write all of the contrary opinions, all of the anathemas, and he issued the edicts banning icons and literally had them removed from churches. And part of this, which is interesting, it's one of those really weird historical connections. The reason that he began to repudiate icons is because he kept losing militarily. There were natural disasters. And, go figure, he started to get pressure from both the Jewish and Islamic communities. And remember, we're right now in the 700s, we're still involved in a tussle with Islam. So Leo was reacting to this. And then his son, Constantine V, becomes the hammer against icons. He was the most aggressive and systematic opponent of iconodualism or iconodulia. He was so opposed that he convened the Council of Hira, Hiera, in 754. Remember that, because we're going to come back to that at the end. That is a very important council in the picture of the icon controversy. And the Council of Hira condemned icons as both idolatrous and unbiblical. Obviously, it's kind of redundant.
What year
But-
was the Council of Hera?
754. But what Constantine V did, and part of the reason this council becomes problematic is because he was the one that ran it. It was, for all intents and purposes, a political council. And keep that in mind, because when we get to the end, the Second Council of Nicaea had something to say about that. He was so adamant against Iconodulists that he persecuted them, and he especially persecuted the monks. And he created an entire theological framework opposing icons. So we have Leo kind of in an odd situation, coming out against. Then we have his son saying, don't you dare disagree with my daddy, and I'm really going to push forward. Well, then we have Leo IV, and he continued the iconoclastic policy. However, he was a bit more moderate. Not so much persecuting, not so much torturing people. Okay? And there's really no way to determine how it would have played out had he not died 5 years later. Because his death led to Irene essentially stepping in as the imperial legate, regent, and then calling the Second Council, which started in, as we saw, it started in Constantinople and had to be moved. But she was the one that called it. I'm going to get to the Council of Hera. Well, I'll talk about it right now since it's an iconoclastic. The council was attended by 338 bishops. Now, given the number of bishops we have seen along the way in various ecumenical councils, we would think, hey, 338 bishops, that's pretty significant, right? That's a lot of people. It's a lot of pointy hats running around. They declared icons heretical, and these were the arguments. Christ cannot be depicted without separating or confusing his natures. What does that sound like? Separating.
The story.
Confusing.
Monophysite.
So they're arguing that no matter what you do, when you interact with an icon, you're going to have a problem with either one of these. Okay. Number two. The only true image of Christ is found where?
In Scripture.
Shrouded tomb.
No, the only true image, the only true physical image of Christ is found where? I'll give you a hint. We participate in it every Sunday. Eucharist. Okay? And this is kind of like a thumbing your nose charge, but painting saints is vain and introduced by the devil. That's what it said in the council. All right? There were two very prominent bishops that participated. Anastasius of Constantinople, but his death, or by his death, he was a moderate, and by his death, Constantine ascended and it allowed the emperor to convene the Council of Hera. And then there was Theodosius of Ephesus, and he presided over the council. Numerous Eastern bishops who endorsed the council's decrees enforced the removal of icons. How about that for a surprise? Now, I'm going to pause right there because when we get to the end, you'll see why this became a problem. So let's look now at this. And you don't have to do anything because I printed the entire comparison to you. Please take one and pass it around. All right? That gives you it gives you the overview of the comparison between the East and the West's position. And we're going to go through it, we're going to go through it piece by piece, so that you can see not only what each side says, but you can get a sense as to how the usage of icons is both different and accepted. Okay? So when we look at the East, well, these are the five categories that are looked at when we talk about the issue of the use of icons in both East and West. Theological, liturgical, stylistic and aesthetic, philosophical and theological, I left it out, and then the historical trajectory. Where did it go when we got to this? All right? Let's go through it rather than reading it. That's why I don't hand these things out. Number one, theological. Icons, according to the East, and by the way, primarily I'm talking about the Eastern Orthodox Church. I'm not engaging the Oriental Church, even though for the most part, the Oriental Church probably would agree with most of this.
The current church, the current Eastern churches and the current Western
I'm talking
churches?
about the Eastern Orthodox Church then,
Okay.
and the Oriental Church I'm leaving out. What's the question?
I thought when we last did that council thing that the East was against icons.
Some bishops.
Some bishops, okay.
That's what I said. I said some bishops, some Eastern bishops agreed with the Council of Hera. That changes, and that's why I'm holding off.
Okay.
Okay, so theologically, the East states this: icons are grounded, we've heard this, they're grounded in the incarnation because the Word became flesh and he can be depicted in images. Now, I'm going to leave this to you to determine whether or not you accept or reject these things. Because there is a considerable issue that arises out of this council. Of all of the councils, this is probably the most controversial of the 7 ecumenical councils. Not only is this the most controversial, but Reformation churches, Protestantism specifically, reject 5, 6, and 7 out of hand. They don't even pay attention to 5, 6, and 7. I think that's an overreach, but that's what the position is. So the East says, because icons are grounded in the incarnation, because the Word became flesh, Jesus can be depicted. Now, does that mean we can depict him from the side, we can depict him on the cross as long as we don't see his face? Or can we include pictures of his face? You have to remember there are people around at this time who were involved in, let's just say, imagery, recreating images, who saw Jesus. Now, we have no unified or unanimous consent as to what he looks like, but there are general characteristics that most have until we get into the Renaissance and Botticelli and his nice soft little baby chubby cheeks and all of that and blue eyes. But anyway, so they also say icons are sacramental signs. Sacramental signs, not sacraments themselves, but participating in divine reality. And this is one of those things where, on the one hand, if you said this and stopped, we could, okay, maybe, but by the fact that you go that second step, you create problems. Participating in divine reality. See, this is where you get the main concerns between East and West. Because the East has no compunction. There's very, very little concern with metaphysics. As a matter of fact, it's incredibly important. Now, we wouldn't deny that. I don't deny that. But when you start talking about creating images and then what these images do, and that's the word, what they do, causes the hair on your neck to stand up. They place a strong emphasis on the image. Basically, they place a strong image on Basil's type image prototype. Honor given to the icon passes through to Christ or to the saint. And the word that is used consistently is the icon is a window. Is a window. And icons are part of the church's dogmatic confession that comes out of the Second Council of Nicaea. Now the West, and it was interesting as I was going through this, I was just checking off things that I would say, okay, I've got half of the West checked off because of how they interpret icons. So the West theologically says icons are permitted because they teach, they inspire devotion, and remain faithful. They remain faithful to and of holy realities. Notice there's no metaphysical connection they're making here. The West accepts Nicaea too, but it doesn't develop the same metaphysic of icons as deeply as the East. So here we see the first real separation. The West emphasizes didactic teaching and moral functions more than sacramental participation. Now I want you to think about this because we're here in the 8th century, and this is the breakdown between the East and the West. And they're saying, at this time, there is no sacramental participation understood by the West. Where are we today?
Right there.
Are we? In the Roman Church? Does the Roman Church believe there's no sacramental participation? You ever walk into a Roman cathedral and see old ladies lighting candles to the statues of Mary? Now we can argue that that's because of the ignorance of the individual, but that ignorance is based upon the fact that the priests are not teaching properly. So that means there's confusion even in Rome as to what is taking place. So back then, yeah, they did not accept sacramental participation. Now, it's a toss-up. The West believes images are holy, but they are not treated as dogmatically essential. In other words, you can remove them all, no harm, no foul.
Is there two understandings of the word holy? Because every Sunday we say, holy, 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 Lord God Almighty. What does that do when we use the word holy in relationship to an icon?
Well, it depends on whether we're talking about Greek or Hebrew, but holy simply means consecrated, that which is set apart for spiritual use in worshiping God. All right, but that's not the only meaning of the word holy. The Hebrew word is far more powerful, far more profound. It actually conveys the idea of gravitas. When you see Isaiah on his knees saying, holy, 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 he's not saying God set apart for holy worship or spiritual worship for himself. He's saying there is something profoundly different about this being. Okay? So context is going to determine what we mean by holy at any given time. But generally speaking, the way we use it upstairs is that which is set apart for spiritual use and service and worship to God. But when we get to the Trisagion, that's when it takes on the Hebrew understanding.
Okay.
So now, the East has a liturgical use, and this is what really, this is what separates the men from the boys. Because the East sees icons as critical, and I'm going to start from the bottom and work my way up, because the last one is just amazing. They see icons as integral in liturgy for lighting lamps before icons, kissing icons, processing with icons, and then there's the iconostasis. The iconostasis in and of itself is this massive window into the divine. It is through the iconostasis. And when you look at an actual iconostasis, depending upon the Eastern Church you visit, when Benita and I were in Prague, we went to all of the churches, and most of them are Eastern churches, just gorgeous churches. But the iconostasis is, it was an interesting physical difference, because they all had numerous images, but some of the churches had fewer images but larger images. They were big, almost life-size. And then some of them had smaller images, but like a honeycomb, everywhere. And when you enter and you see what is taking place, is that you are participating in heavenly worship through the great cloud of witnesses that are watching. And this is a window into the Holy of Holies and the divine realm where the triune Godhead lives. Very different than pretty much anybody else. But you can ask our brethren who come from the East. That's a very, very powerful emotional experience to experience that. If I had been healthier, I would have stayed through a whole service, but I can't stand for 3 hours. But anyway, when that part comes, erase this with my arm. When that part of the service arrives, you really are blown away. It's something. And that's, as I've said on many occasions, I think when it comes to understanding the relationship between heaven and earth, nobody can compare to the East. They really do a marvelous job of making that connection. The West, on the other hand, images are present, but not structurally. We already talked about this. Not structurally essential. There is no iconostasis. Images for the West are essentially flexible. You can put it here, you can put it there. Okay? Now, you can venerate, kneel, kiss, etc., but images are not structurally required for liturgy. Take it or leave it, basically. And if you, how many people have ever been to New York during the Feast of St. Gennaro, Feast of St. John? Okay. I'm going to give you a brief, just a brief description. It's one of the most important and well it was, I don't know if they even do it anymore with this numbnuts in governor's office. But it's one of the most it was one of the most important and well-attended feasts for the Roman Church in New York. You can't, the cops have to literally block streets off for about a mile in New York. And what happens is you get clergy from all over, every Roman church in Little Italy, marching through, holding up the statues. And people run alongside putting money at the base of the statues and kissing the feet of the Virgin as she goes by.
Wasn't that somehow depicted in
It's in The Godfather.
2 when
Yeah.
he was going down there?
Yes. Yeah. You get a brief glimpse of it. But it's as close to what the East talks about when it comes to veneration and kissing and honoring and all of that. Now, you're not going to tell me, having been raised in that and lived through that and experienced that and seen that those people are not worshiping those images that are coming through. You just can't tell that. I don't buy that. I watched them, women weeping, men wailing as the statue goes by. So, very, very close to what the West does. Then we get the style and the aesthetic. The East, not naturalistic or symbolic or theological. In other words, it's not exclusively something for teaching. There's a real participation. The purpose is to reveal the transfigured reality of the saint or whomever else is represented. And the canons present a very, very strict list of behaviors. It presents what your posture is supposed to be, what colors are supposed to be used, the proportions of the icons, and what is to be written on the icons. And the point is for timelessness. Remember, the East focuses on metaphysics. Metaphysics transcends the physical. That which transcends the physical is outside of time, therefore these images should be timeless. The West, on the other hand, moves increasingly towards naturalism, specifically Middle Ages onward, very naturalistic representation of the individual. And the purpose is to evoke emotion, empathy, and narrative clarity. It's supposed to be very clear as to what we're doing here. So, for the West, it embraces perspective. Sometimes you're looking at a larger image being depicted, sometimes very narrow. So the perspective will change depending upon what is attempted to be taught. Then there's anatomical realism. And this becomes very prominent as you move more and more and more and more into the Renaissance. Okay, if you look at some of the earlier depictions, they can be kind of fuzzy, not silly, but not really well defined. But as you move more and more, it becomes much sharper. And what you see in the West, as you start developing, is there's more dramatic representation. St. George, the dragon slayer, stabbing, St. Christopher holding the Christ child on his shoulder, carrying all of these dramatic pictures start to come through in the West. And then as we get to the Renaissance, this truly becomes intensified. And then we get into the philosophical and the theological emphases on what's taking place. And as you can probably imagine, there's going to be some significant differences between East and West. Icons are theology in color, as far as the East is concerned. And I actually like that phrase, What the icons do is it takes whatever theological doctrine we're dealing with, whatever person we're encountering, and it adds flavor. Let's put it this way. It's not a flat understanding. And that color brings out life to what we're watching and what we're seeing. All right? Strong emphasis on the mystical participation and theosis, deification. Now, it's important to understand, because we've now discussed two of the three terms that the East uses. We talked about theurgy last week, theosis this week, and the third one is apotheosis. Theosis is the process of transformation. I'm going to simplify this very, very simply. You can look up the definitions. They're obviously richer than what I'm going to say. But just for the sake of discussion, theosis is the process of moving towards deification. Apotheosis is the arrival at deification, and theurgy is that kind of in between, trying to, I don't want to phrase it that way, trying to induce or to motivate the God to respond to something, to participate in the world, okay? So those are the three things, and right here when we are looking at the philosophical theological meaning, that is where the East falls down. Icons reveal the eschatological human nature and that is transfigured by grace. Icons reveal what man is ultimately going to be here on earth. All right? And the icon is a window. It is not a flat, two-dimensional picture. Okay? For the West, images are visual theology, not metaphysical mediators. There is the emphasis on moral instruction, biblical storytelling, and devotional focus, but not deification. And images are representations, they are not windows. All right? Now, finally, where does all of this drive us? The trajectory. Well, for the East, it reaches its peak with John of Damascus and Theodore of Studite. And iconoclasm forces the East to articulate a dogmatic theology of icons. And then, due to that, icons become inseparable from Orthodox identity. Okay? The West, on the other hand, never actually experiences a full iconoclastic crisis because they don't imbibe some of the same theological and philosophical concepts. It's as if it's kind of more of a, I don't mean to insult the West, but it's more of a simplistic or dumbed down version. Okay? The real issue comes with the Carolingians, Charles Martel and Charlemagne. They provide and critique aspects of the Second Council of Nicaea, but they don't reject images. Okay? You can find their critiques in the Libri Carolini, or the Carolinian book. And they argued that Nicaea, too, erred by promoting veneration of images, which they believed risked idolatry. They accepted images for instruction and decoration, but denied them any cultic or devotional status. And then once we hit the age of scholasticism, it shifts the emphasis towards conceptual theology, not visual metaphysics. In other words, what does this picture tell us theologically, not how does this picture present a window to the divine. And then, of course, once we get to the Reformation, all of this gets flushed down the toilet. Okay? So, that takes us to one final mess. Okay. You have a chart there that I hope helps you understand where all of this goes. What wound up happening was this. At the end of the Second Council of Nicaea, Iconodulism was dogmatized. You could not reject it. The Council of Hera was overturned and rejected because the argument goes, pay close attention to this, it was not a recognized ecumenical council. And this becomes critical because when the Protestants start looking through church history in an attempt to reject iconodualism, guess what council they reference? Council of Hera. And we'll get into why that becomes critical in a moment. In the Second Council of Nicaea, there were 17 anathemas issued. I'm going to read some of them. I'm not going to read all of them. If anyone shall not confess according to the tradition of the apostles, fathers, Father, Son, and Holy Ghost, one Godhead, nature, substance, will, operation, virtue, dominion, kingdom, power in three substances, that is in their most glorious person, let him be anathema. If anyone does not confess that one of the Trinity was made flesh, let him be anathema. Now that sets the stage, because later on, if anyone ventures to represent human figures by means of material colors, by reason of the incarnation, the substance or person, ousia of hypostasis of the word, which cannot be depicted, and does not rather confess that even after the incarnation he cannot be depicted, let him be anathema. So in other words, all of these things happened with the incarnation, and if you say we can't depict it, you're anathema. And goes on and on and on. 17 of them. Now, if you take Basil of Ankara, who was an iconoclast, one of the guys that would have sided with the Eastern bishops in Hera, who then repents, he lists 10 additional anathemas. Anyone is an anathema to the calumniators of the Christians, that is the image breakers, anyone who speaks badly. Anathema to those who apply the words of the Holy Spirit, Holy Scripture, which were spoken against idols to the venerable image, let him be anathema. Anathema to those who do not salute the holy and venerable image. This is Basil essentially summarizing the 17. So now we've got 27 anathemas. All right? So there's no question that this was contentious. Now what we have to reconcile today is, what do we do with the anathemas? Do we accept the anathemas? Do we accept the first 7 ecumenical councils? If we do, with which side do we identify? Do we identify with the East, or do we identify with the West? And if we identify with either one, what is our justification for identifying with either one? Do we believe that icons are windows into the divine? Do we believe that icons share the same hypostasis? Same essence? See the problems? So now we have the Second Council of Nicaea saying, you're all going to hell if you don't accept our decision on icons. But then we have Hera, the Council of Hera. And the reason that the East and the Second Council of Nicaea specifically, one of the primary reasons they reject the Council of Hera is because Constantine V was the one that was driving it, even though there were 338 bishops. And they claim it's not a legitimate ecumenical council, but we know there were Eastern bishops there that sided with the Iconoclasts. What do we do with that, especially when we get to the Second Council of Nicaea, which didn't have actual patriarchs from Alexandria and Jerusalem and Antioch present because they were battling Muslims, but they sent their monks to represent them. But does that make a council ecumenical simply because representatives are there? Additionally, does it make it ecumenical since we're missing 3/5 of all of the patriarchs? Now, for me, and this is not going to be satisfying to anyone, but I will tell you, when I look at this, I see pros and cons with this. And I think you've heard me say, icons, yeah, I mean, as long as you're not worshiping them, you know, sacrificing goats or little children to them, that's, you know, if you want to have an icon, you can have it, that's fine. I think the council goes too far with the anathemas. Especially when you sit and you look, and you have the chart, you can look at that chart that I gave you. When you have the chart, and it places them side by side, and you see what each of them are saying, there's a marked difference. So, what is it upon which they are agreeing? They're not agreeing on the metaphysical reality of it. But yet, when you read the language of the anathemas, it's as if that's what's being anathematized, that you have to believe their windows and then in this and that and the other thing. Well, the West doesn't accept that, but the West was not anathematized. So, for me, if I were coming to this, trying to steer a path through this, there are things that the East says that I understand and I can reconcile. I think John of Damascus's concept of matter, perfectly valid, not how far he goes with it, but the goodness of matter, the fact that Christ's incarnation means he is the icon of the Father and he is depicted in human terms. Depicted is not actually the right word for the incarnation, but he is the representation, the exact representation of the Father in human terms. I would feel, and maybe it's just because I'm Western, but I would feel much more comfortable adopting some of the elements of the East, but standing on the West while not saying anyone that rejects icons is anathematized, because there's no unanimity and agreement on what it means. That's how I would reconcile this. Since the council never, and this is one of the reasons it's controversial, because it never really resolved the question. It simply presented two pictures, and both of them said the same thing at one point. Yeah, icons are okay. But after that, there's marked divergence. And then we get into what I've got here, and this is essentially the summation of what we've been looking at over all of these weeks. Conciliar effectiveness. How do we understand conciliar effectiveness in church history? We know that the Council of Nicaea in 325 established the true nature of Christ, right? Which was ignored for 60 years. So is that conciliar effectiveness? We know that Chalcedon determined the true understanding of the Godhead, right? And then we had battles for the for the next 200 years. The Monophysites, the Miaphysites, well, the same thing with a different spelling, but we had all of this. Conciliar effectiveness? Well, for me, conciliar effectiveness is the establishment of proper doctrine to be applied in everyday life. That doesn't mean that we're not going to battle moving forward, right? We still deal with heresy today. We still have those battles. Then we have ecclesiastical unity. And I think I mentioned this last week or the week before. I was on Facebook and there was a picture of, it was from an Eastern Orthodox site, and it said, AD 33, 2,000 years of unity. I chuckled first. And then I went down and I commented. And this is 2 weeks ago. I commented on the Eastern Orthodox site. And all I said was, in AD 451, the Council of Chalcedon established Chalcedonian Orthodoxy. And the Eastern Church immediately split into two theologically distinct groups. The Orthodox, Eastern Orthodox Church and the Oriental Orthodox Church. And they have been divided ever since. Demonstrating even recently the division when the various patriarchs got together to discuss reunification. Well, if they're not divided, why are they reunifying? Okay? That's just the East. We know in Rome, after Nicaea 325, the North African church said, you can go pound sand. And they were separate for 60 years. Okay, they were finally brought back in, but, oh wait, there's more. Then we have the Aquila schism that separated the church after the Third Council of Constantinople for 150 years. So there is no justifiable claim anywhere by anybody, and I don't mean anybody as in person, I mean any ecclesiastical body, that there has been unification without division. That just does not exist. That is a myth. If you have sinful men, sinful people involved in any activity, there's going to be problems. And then we see the difficulty with church-state relations. We saw it start almost benignly with Constantine. Hi guys, we're having a problem in the empire. Can you get together and get your crap together so I don't have to fight all these battles out in the real world? And that was the nose of the camel in the tent, because once that happened, it got worse and worse and worse and worse until we get Constantine V actually running a council. And we see the problems today as the trajectory, as I've used this illustration 100 times. When we used to plot artillery courses, we would plot them down to the 8th grid coordinate. And if you fire around and you're just one grid coordinate off, if you fire it downrange 1 mile, oh, you may miss the target by 100 yards. But if you fire it 16 miles downrange, you're going to blow up a hospital or an orphanage. And that's where we are today. We are well past 16 miles downrange. And then conciliar ecumenicity. Now, how many councils have we encountered that were identified as ecumenical councils where there were questions? Council of Constantinople. It's like, wait, This is not, there's only 150 bishops. This is not supposed to be an ecumenical council. Until, we grandfather it in much later, and then we say, oh yeah, okay, yeah, well, yeah, it's an ecumenical council. Why? Because you agree with the decisions? And then we see Hera. What's wrong with Hera? If ecumenical councils are the councils with the representation of the patriarchies, Hera has Eastern and Western patriarch. Actually, for Hera, there was more bishops than patriarchs, but there was Eastern and Western representation in Hera. Was it we're just getting our panties in a bunch because an emperor led the council? And then we get to the Second Council of Nicaea, where we have 2 of the 5 patriarchies present. Not as clear-cut and simple as everybody wants to make it out. And this is one of the reasons that the Protestants look back and they said, you know what? 5, 6, and 7, we don't need them. Now, I think, as I said, I think that's going a bridge too far, but that's the argument. And anytime you start talking about the anathemas, they start talking about Hera. So that sums up everything that we've done and all this time. Okay? Any questions?